I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Matt Bernico, and I teach media studies at Greenville University in Greenville, Illinois.
I'm Dean Detloff. I'm a PhD student at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto.
This week we're revisiting a topic that we've done a podcast about before. This week we're going to talk about violence and a little bit more about what that means. If you're tired of hearing about violence, sorry, it's an important idea that we should figure out. But before that, we have some announcements.
First announcement, I'm going to teach a really neat class at ICS, and it's online, and it is very cheap, and you can and should take it. We got kind of a special deal where ICS is going to offer the class for $90 Canadian, which is like $2 American, and anybody can take it. There's going to be some registration stuff up on their website soon, but I thought I'd pitch it here because a lot of the materials are definitely of interest to folks listening to the Magnificast. Some of the stuff we've talked about, in fact, on this podcast before. Some of it we haven't. But the class is called Organized Religion, Christianity, and Anti-Capitalism in the U.S. and Canada. So if you're interested in that at all, you can go ahead and check that out. Pretty soon the syllabus will be posted. We're going to do some getting to know each other, getting to know the history of Christianity and how Christians have resisted capitalism in these two countries, and going from the Haymarket riots and rebellion all the way through to Occupy and Black Lives Matter and some other kind of more recent phenomena. So if you are interested in that or you want more information, get at me. I'm super excited that I get to teach it and finally get to actually say something about it. I've been sitting on this knowledge for a long, long time. It finally cleared the hurdle today. So I hope to see a bunch of people there.
Sign up for the Magnificast.
That is it. The Magnificast. You can't get a cheaper, cooler class anywhere else. So
yeah,
it's your loss.
$90 for some graduate credits. Not so bad.
No, it's pretty good even.
Yeah. Yep. Cool. One more update. So important. Really got to tie this one up here. Last week we kind of talked about and endorsed using the app Church Home. And we told you about all the weird, good Christian left stuff going on there. And after we recorded that episode, some good and interesting things continued to happen. I think we were up to almost 200 people using the app, and on the Christian leftist sort of subgroup, we were making prayer requests, we were praying for people, we were talking and just kind of just having a good time. And then repression happened. Dean, I don't know if you experienced this, but I was my ability to register prayer requests on that website was taken away.
The iron hammer of the megachurch finally came down, removed your ability to pray. It's pretty wild.
Yeah, no kidding. The white army of Christians came and said, no, your socialist prayers are not good here. And they said, please do not do it.
It's pretty funny how all that happened. Connor, all power to Connor, the Marxist Jesus on Twitter.
Chairman Connor.
Chairman Connor, that's right. Really leading the people's army on the Church Home app and praying the people's prayers, trying to organize and coordinate everyone. Actually, he was pretty dedicated to working all that stuff out. Spent a lot of time trying to get people, having really cool conversation spaces and really like inviting people to share, and that was a very cool thing. But rip church home. I don't know. Once you were cool. Well, once you were like kind of okay because we were there.
Once you were a fun joke, and
cool.
now you're not anymore.
Once you were a fun joke that like surprisingly turned into something like actually kind of meaningful, and then now you're just kind of a fun. Now you're a not fun joke.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting because it was totally a joke for a minute, right? We were always on there, doing some fun jokey things, but then it got real and people were actually giving real prayer requests, and like we were kind of like talking, and it was cool.
Yeah.
Isn't it wild though that like there are Christians in the world who would rather just exclude leftists from their community than just like let them pray and stuff?
It's super wild.
Yeah.
It's especially wild that the prayer requests of things like, hey, maybe we shouldn't have white supremacy or shouldn't have capitalism are prayers that are suspicious.
Yeah, exactly. It's bad news. Church home, you should feel bad about this. Leftist Christians out there, we all moved to a Slack channel so that we could pray together and talk together. And that's cool too. Again, thank you, Connor, for setting all that up, because it probably was a lot of work. Probably.
Probably. Well, let's get into the meat of this episode here.
Wait, I have one more joke.
Done a couple.
That church home was kind of
okay.
It was just kind of like our commune, and it just got pushed right over.
Church Commune is the new app.
Church
gonna hit your web
oh my
stores
gosh.
real soon.
If someone made Church Commune app, that'd be so good.
It can't be that hard.
How do you make an app?
I mean, I think that you fill out the app and then it's made.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
All right, we gotta go. We gotta get out of here. We gotta get into this episode. So if you haven't heard us talk about violence, you probably haven't listened to this podcast for very long, and that's fine. Welcome. We're glad to have you. But if you've been listening for a while, you'll know that we did a couple of episodes about violence in the past already, and it is like a perennial topic that sort of comes and goes. So we figured, like, instead of trying to situate violence in a ton of other conversations like we've been doing, we would just confront it head on, do an episode about it, kind of decontextualized, thinking about what it is, what it's about, how Christians could think about it, and we're gonna try our best to go at this in a way that is responsible, intelligent, true, loving, sweet, and ultimately in a way that builds up the church commune.
Yeah, I think to me this is such like an intimate issue for my life, because what actually got me into sort of like the Christian leftist scene was thinking about these like questions of violence and pacifism. So tackling this question and kind of like really parsing out like what violence even is, sort of like at a, I don't want to say philosophical level, but at a level that's grander than just like kind of looking at a situation and saying it's violent. It's just important to me. It's like kind of how I got where I am right now in this conversation. So this the discourse surrounding violence and Christianity is I don't know, means a lot.
Yeah, same here. I had the same exact situation. I think a lot of people who especially come in through the anarchist door to Christian leftism also end up kind of coming in through the nonviolence door. And there's a lot of really good things about coming into it that way. I think there's a lot of good lessons to be learned through it. But a lot more to consider within the context of all that conversation too. So one big problem with violence, I think, is just getting clear about our actual terms. Like, what are we talking about when we talk about violence? Or to put it another way, what are we trying not to talk about when we talk about violence or nonviolence? Pope Francis had an address last year that I think illustrates this pretty well. So he talked about nonviolence as what he calls a style of politics for peace. And he has a lot of good points, but he never actually tells us what violence or nonviolence are. We're left to figure it out or fill in the blanks of what we think that violence is or isn't. I think there's like a lot of really good stuff that comes out of nonviolent activism for sure. But what would it mean to like really investigate violence from a Christian perspective? I think that's something that we don't often jump into intuitively. So there's a ton of stuff out there. We can obviously only scratch the surface here, but maybe we could start with this quote from Juan Luis Segundo. He was a Jesuit liberation theologian from Uruguay, and this is from his book, The Liberation of Theology. So he says in a conversation on violence there, any phenomenological study of violence and its relationship to love must begin by discarding the terrible superficiality that surrounds many analyses of this issue.
So we can just do that. Try not to be superficial here. not be superficial about violence or nonviolence and try to treat them in their fullness. But before we go any further, let's take another quick quote from Segundo. It's another good quote that will help us get into some of the problems about this definition even more. So Segundo carries on and says, would the term violence apply to a firearm, a stick, a punch, an insult, a prejudice, a pervasive social structure? Without suggesting that there is any hypocrisy at work here, I do think that it is sociologically significant that all the talk about violence comes in the connection with the subject of revolution, but not in connection with such subjects as the police or the army, for example. And even if we were to find Christian groups inclined to fight equally against armed revolution and an armed government, we would still face the task of correcting a dreadfully superficial definition of what constitute, quote, arms. It is quite clear that conscious and unconscious mental tendencies can constitute a weapon more effective in killing millions of people than any weapon that is traditionally viewed as an armament. So why focus the whole problem of violence around the picture of a person bearing arms? It's a good question. Why?
Yeah, why?
This is, I think, a really cool way to put it. Right. This is actually the type of sort of calculus that I think I know that I am guilty of having done at one time. Like, what counts as actually violence? Firearms, sticks, a punch, an insult. Yep. All those things are violent, and we should not do them all, and we should all be just really good pacifists. And I would have even have gone as far to say that, like, that's why we should sort of, like, be anarchists even. And that's cool. But I think that the larger question still remains. It is quite clear, as Segundo says, that conscious and unconscious mental tendencies can constitute a weapon more effective in killing millions of people than any weapon that is traditionally viewed as an armament, meaning that ideology is indeed a hell of a drug, and it is a thing that has been used to justify people for a long time.
Yeah, for sure. I think, too, that question of what is bearing arms or what is violence, those are the kinds of questions that started moving me in a direction that was a little more nuanced on the question of violence after being a really hardline pacifist. I think for a long time I just took it for granted that violence was an obvious thing, two people are hurting each other, or like one person is hurting someone else, and that's what violence is, I guess. Or there's an instrument specifically being used in a, quote, violent way. That's an arm, that constitutes arms. But the more I've thought about it, the more it seems way more complicated to me. And those kinds of critical questions, it's like once you start asking them, it's really hard to see the bottom. Like once you start sort of climbing down that ladder into investigating it. So yeah, I mean, I think it's just a good way of framing the conversation of being like, at what point would you draw the line and say, this is violent, and it's violent in such a way that you could be non-violent, like you could negate that violence as a pattern in your life.
This isn't like a fleshed out theory or anything, but to me, it always seems more helpful to think about violence rather than like sort of categories, just like intensities, in a sense that, like, we can say that some things, I mean, violence is a relationship of bodies. I guess that is, a pretty theoretical thing, but like, the intensity of that relationship between those bodies is kind of what we have to start figuring out. Like, we can compare things that are violent and kind of figure out, like, to what extent are they violent, and in like what context are they violent. I guess just like finding that nuance in the categorization of violence ends up being a hard conversation, but one that we probably still need to figure out.
Yeah, for sure. And maybe to kind of muddy the waters a little bit more too, when we think about violence as a term that we use in everyday life, violence comes up in all kinds of weird, like very weird situations that cause us to think, I think, a little bit harder about what it means. So for example, somebody harming another person is clearly violent, we would say, in one way or another. But we also talk about a volcanic eruption being violent, or someone playing a sport in a violent way. But it's not necessarily bad. I mean, if somebody is sort of, violently, I don't know, driving a lane in basketball or something, that isn't necessarily a bad thing. It doesn't have to be a bad thing. And there's all kinds of ways of maybe choosing different words, like the use of force or a power or something like that to describe something like a volcano. But I think it's important to realize that violence is a term that is multi-dimensional in our everyday use, and it also makes it more and more complicated to think both about violence and nonviolence. Well, let's talk about like why people feel weird about it. This might sound like a dumb thing to just open up a question with, but it makes obvious sense. Like, people are repelled by suffering, right? And all the bad things that inevitably come, even with violence that we might say is justified. Like, even if you thought that there was a kind of violence that could be defended or could be reasonable, nevertheless, there are very bad things that come along with that justified violence. I think nobody would really deny that. And also, like, violence, I think, though, means that some things change, and that's really terrifying, especially for people like us or other people who have, like, a lot of privilege to lose. So I think those are at least two kind of big reasons that people feel understandably kind of weird about conversations around violence. On the one hand, people don't want to see an increase in bad things or suffering in the world, and violence does bring those things. And secondly, like, people don't really want to engage in a dialogue that might also bring up a host of other problems. I don't know, Matt, what do you think? Why do you think people sort of feel weird about violence, or why did you at one point?
Yeah, what you said, that like people are repelled by suffering, I think is on the right track. I would even go as far to say, though, that like people are repelled by suffering. That's true. But we find ways to make sense of that suffering in the world. As long as we can find ways to make sure that we aren't culpable for that suffering, like, that's kind of the important piece. Like, suffering is bad, but we can kind of like justify it or kind of understand it in one way or another. But if we are somehow responsible for that suffering, we feel especially bad. So, like, when we extend the conversation of violence from just like individuals attacking one another to like sort of structures that do violence to other people, we start feeling weird about violence and different about violence because like we might actually be responsible for some of it, and that's a feeling that people especially don't like.
Yeah, I don't like it either.
Yeah, I hate it 100%.
Yeah,
that's why I'm a communist, so I guess that kind of does, that does the work of like making me feel less culpable for it, even though I still am.
Yeah, for sure. That is a whole thing that is going to keep me up later tonight. But I think that, like, you should be. I mean, apology accepted, but, like, you should be. I think one of the main things of just bringing this up as, like, why do people feel weird about it is to say, or I guess to highlight from the outset, that I don't think people are dumb for not liking violence. I think that's actually a very, very good impulse, and it's a really challenging impulse. I mean, any person who has tried to be a pacifist or tried to live a nonviolent life for a long time will tell you that it's extremely difficult. It takes an immense amount of creative thinking. It takes an immense amount of courage. And it takes a lot of, I think, really principled action to live a kind of nonviolent or peaceful life that you feel, you're doing a good job at it or something.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think most pacifists probably don't even feel that way, right? It's sort of haunted by the guilt of it. And I guess the point is I don't want to get into a conversation that opens up a nuanced idea about violence in such a way that it says, like, if you don't think that violence is something complicated, then, like, I don't know, you're a big dummy. That's not true.
I think that pacifists are people who know, like, they are people who know something about violence, but I think that maybe, like, sometimes their assessment of it is something I would just disagree with. I mean, I don't know. I think about the Catholic workers who we always reference, who sabotaged the Dakota Access Pipeline and then, like, fessed up to it. Like, they're people that understand violence, I think, pretty well, and they understand, like, what it means to negotiate their lives in light of that violence. But sometimes the conversation just needs more room to, like, grow, I think.
Yeah, and maybe that's another thing to emphasize too, is that there is obviously a complex variation within both conversations about violence and nonviolence that is important not to erase or not to reduce down to, like, well, some people think it's complicated and other people don't, because that's not what we want to say.
Yeah. I think that everyone knows it's complicated, but our responses to it, and I think, like, what we're willing to put up with might be different.
Right. Well, that's a really good segue, I think, into talking about why Christians in particular have a really vested interest in this conversation, or why it becomes a really unique kind of problem for Christians.
Yeah.
I mean, we both mentioned, the two of us had that same sort of origin in thinking about nonviolence and pacifism. Like, it was a direct result of certain Christian commitments, first of all, rather than like political or tactical commitments. At least in my case, that's the truth.
Yeah, completely. It was my sort of like entryway into leftist politics, like through pacifism, where that like Jesus said that you shouldn't like hurt anybody, you shouldn't do violence, you should turn the other cheek, etc. And like I thought that was like that was a moral commandment that I don't think I thought of in the way that I think of it now. And so I thought like resisting violence meant resisting the government and like resisting like the state and stuff like that too. So I think that there are a lot of Christian hangups about violence, whether they are like more radical or if they are just kind of like liberal. But there's a lot of Christian thoughts about violence. So I had mentioned like that my way into sort of leftist politics were these thoughts about violence. And you can find these types of ideas about Christian pacifism like in a lot of different places. But the place I found it first was in Leo Tolstoy's book, The Kingdom of God is Within You. And he talks a lot about the Gospels, and he does kind of some interesting meditations on the Sermon on the Mount. But ultimately what he kind of gets to in the end is a type of like Christian anarchism that's based on pacifism. And it's a really similar argument, I think, that we would make with like Jacques Ellul or somebody, but Leo Tolstoy is just like a little bit cooler and doesn't talk about like cows as much as Jacques Ellul. That's a good inside joke.
A deep cut.
Only people that listen to episode 1 will get that. Don't,
Yikes.
though.
Don't be one of those people.
It's not worth it. Anyways, Leo Tolstoy has this take on violence that's like this. And this is the one that I think I would definitely have ascribed to when I was an undergrad. He says that government is violence. Christianity is meekness. Non-resistance, love, and therefore government cannot be Christian. And a man who wishes to be Christian must not serve the government. It's some good stuff, honestly. I like it. I like it because, I guess because I like sort of like that transgressive feel in it for sure. But that's Leo Tolstoy on like sort of the importance of like not only pacifism, not only rejecting violence, but also rejecting the government in turn. And that's kind of like, the basis for a lot of Christian anarchism. So that's totally a hang up that sort of Christians on the left have about violence. And I think it's not a bad hang up. It's a good one even, but I think it needs some more exploration.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And it's good rhetoric to be like, Christians are so meek that they don't like the government. That's a really nice like juxtaposition.
Yeah,
that
I would just ask Leo Tolstoy like,
weight.
which Christians are you talking about?
Yeah, exactly.
Most of them aren't like that.
Yeah. Most Christians who are upset about the government are not Quakers in the same way that Tolstoy was trying to think about.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he has a lot of things to say too about like more like imperialistic Christians that do serve the government, but still it's kind of like a wishful thinking.
Yeah, I mean, the other person who comes to mind here obviously is Jacques Ellul, who you just mentioned. And even though I think Tolstoy does have a little bit more going for him, so even though he's not quite as cool as Tolstoy, he does kind of put the terms in a way that crystallizes the issue, I think, for a lot of like 20th century and now 21st century Christian pacifists. So he writes, "The Christian nationalists of the 19th century also killed each other in the conviction that Jesus had established nations and that love of country was part of love of God. We find that stupid nowadays." Well, I don't know.
Some of us do.
But can we be sure that 50 years hence, today's pro-revolutionary position will not also seem stupid? Fair. What troubles me is not that the opinions of Christians change, nor that their opinions are shaped by the problems of the times. On the contrary, that's good. What troubles me is that Christians conform to the trend of the moment without introducing into it anything specifically Christian. Their convictions are determined by their social milieu, not by faith in revelation. They lack the uniqueness which ought to be the expression of that faith. Thus, theologies become mechanical exercises that justify the positions adopted and justify them on the grounds that are absolutely not Christian. So that's from an essay, Violence, Reflections from a Christian Perspective. I think you can see a really obvious Protestant, especially, kind of flavor coming out here in Ellul. I mean, there's a real obsession with kind of being faithful to a specific revelation, but obviously it's not unique to Protestants by any stretch. But I think that's like it's a gauntlet that is worth wrestling with. Like, he's not completely wrong that a lot of Christians do just sort of baptize whatever ideas seem right to them without actually analyzing them. And if you did try to interrogate your political ideas by coming at them from the perspective that maybe you're a Christian, you would probably find they don't fit very well all the time. I think, though, that my biggest problem with Elul is that is a problem for pretty much everyone. Like, it isn't the case that pacifists have a really easy time just being pacifists and being Christians. There are plenty of whatever biblical passages or exegeses, etc., that they also have to explain away or wrestle through. And I think that it's completely fair to say that we should think politically as Christians or something like that. But it's also not a cop-out to say that. And I think oftentimes Elul and many other Christian pacifists do sort of take that as an assumed cop-out.
Yeah, and maybe to go back and take back some of what I said about Leo Tolstoy too. Tolstoy does the same thing in Kingdom of God's Within You. He kind of just like he reads the Sermon on the Mount and is just like, I don't know, it's so obvious. Like, you read this, like, how can you disagree that pacifism is sort of like a necessary Christian practice? And what Jacques Ellul, what Leo Tolstoy, I guess like probably what most people don't realize is that these types of Christianity or these readings of Christianity are definitely a hermeneutic project that like you have to build this way of sort of understanding the Bible. It doesn't mean that they're like bad or wrong. It's just that like you gotta recognize that they're not obvious.
They're constructions in the same way that Christians who believe in violence are constructing something.
Yeah, Leo Tolstoy's book though is so funny because he'll just like read a bit of the Sermon on the Mount and then he'll be like, "Wow, that's amazing! How did people not get this?" And it's like, come on, man. you know how you like write books, you get it. It's just like they're projects though, and they have to be constructed and they have to be sort of be like, you know, argued to people persuasively.
Right.
Okay. All of this being said, contextualizing Ellul and Tolstoy as people who are participating in hermeneutic projects, whatever, that's fine. All that to say though, I still do find them like they're really important thinkers for my life because I think probably a lot of people listening to this can empathize or sympathize or whatever. But growing up in a church in the United States means like really like having this type of Christian nationalism and like a Christian like praise of violence definitely in your face. I think about like all the times I've gone to church on 4th of July or whatever, and we've had like Freedom Sunday. Or Freedom Sunday sounds like an ice cream treat, but it was actually like a nationalistic celebration in church. Or, you know, like you have sort of like Veterans Day things at churches where sort of like the American mythology of just violence is really praised and associated with a Christian type of justice or something. Ellul and Tolstoy both like leave something to be desired in this conversation about violence, but at the same time, they were really good people for me to help me really like kind of question those things that like my church told me or that I just kind of knew from the Christian milieu.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. And that Ellul quote we were just talking about, I think is really powerful in that way. I mean, it was a powerful rhetoric for me to basically be like, oh yeah, wait a second. I am a Christian, which means I should probably think twice about what's on TV or what my pastor says from the pulpit or something. That kind of agency or permission that sometimes a certain kind of Christian rhetoric that has to do with like taking ownership of your faith can give you, that can be important. It can also be really dangerous, I think, and it can like forestall you from asking some critical questions. Yeah. But for sure, like it can be used very effectively, no doubt about that.
Yeah, it's something that I think American Christians need to hear.
Right.
Like if I could go to the next Freedom Sunday and like in the midst of a praise band playing I'm Proud to Be an American, just hand out sort of copies of Jacques Ellul, Essay on Violence, I would. And I wouldn't feel bad about it. It'd be good.
Yeah, that's true. Well, let's turn a hinge here a little bit and maybe bring in some class struggle and some Christianity by talking about our favorite Dominican, Herb McCabe, as we decided to talk about him earlier. So this comes from one of the best essays ever called Class Struggle and Christian Love, where McCabe writes, this is kind of a long quote, but I think it's worth kind of reading in full because he pulls out a ton of issues that I think help maybe present like a counterpoint to certain anarchist and pacifist strands within Christianity. So McCabe writes, first of all, let us eliminate some fairly simple confusions. Nice. One of them arises out of the word struggle itself, and a lot of other words that get themselves used in this context. Exhortations to smash the bourgeois state, or for increased militancy, are all violent uses of language, so that argument about the class struggle gets mixed up with an argument about violence. People committed to the class struggle are thought to be people especially addicted to trying to solve political and economic problems by violence. Now, this is a muddle. There is a Christian argument against the use of violence, and there's another Christian argument about participating in the class struggle. Both of these arguments are, I think, mistaken, but they are different arguments because the class struggle and political violence are by no means the same thing. It is perfectly possible to believe passionately in the importance of the class struggle and to renounce all political violence. It would be perfectly possible for a Christian to hold that the gospel prevents them from ever killing anyone, but positively encourages them to subvert and overthrow the ruling class. Further than that, a Christian or a non-Christian might well say that political violence is not only different from class struggle, but is actually opposed to it. So I think that it's really helpful that McCabe is trying to do that work that Segundo talked about earlier of coming at the question of violence in a way that is not superficial, but really getting into the details of it, thinking hypothetically about different positions that one might have as a Christian, specifically as a Christian, about violence, and also trying to uncouple those things from other kinds of questions about things like class struggle or societal violence, or however you want to cash that out. I think it's just a really important way of framing the whole conversation.
Yeah, I think the end of this quote is maybe the most powerful for me. A Christian or non-Christian might as well say that political violence is not only different from the class struggle, but is actually opposed to it. I think that's kind of what I meant earlier when I was saying that when we talk about violence, we ought to think about it in terms of intensity or different sort of genre, right, or something like that. But class struggle is violent, but maybe not politically violent in the way that repression is, or politically violent in the way that imperialism is.
Right.
Just helps us think through it in a different way.
Totally. And I'm going to pull out another quote from this essay just because it's very, very good. Yeah. So kind of extending that same point, McCabe says, how could revolutionary violence be compatible with the Sermon on the Mount? Well, first of all, in this matter, we should not lose our sense of humor. There's something especially ludicrous about Christian church people coming around to the belief that violence is wrong. There's probably no sound on earth so bizarre as the noise of clergymen bleating about terrorism and revolutionary violence while their cathedrals are stuffed with regimental flags and monuments to colonial wars. The Christian church, with minor exceptions, has been solidly on the side of violence for centuries, but normally it has only been the violence of soldiers and policemen. It's only when the poor catch on to violence that it suddenly turns out to be against the Bible, right, or against the gospel. So I just think that's also a really important feature of this whole conversation, to find out who gets to talk about violence and whose violence is not justifiable.
Yeah, I think that's also what I meant too by culpability earlier too, that right. There's a certain type of just violence that sort of keep people safe or something like that, or preserve social order. And that type of violence is worth it because we don't find ourselves, culpable in it or something, or we don't see how we might because other people are actually doing it. So the sort of state-sponsored violence of police oppression or imperialistic kind of invasion or force or whatever, those are types of violence that sit well with Christians because they're pretty well removed from it, or there's a mythos surrounding it where it seems very just that it's a type of violence that they're not responsible for and is also sort of good in the way that it keeps a certain type of peace.
Right. And to the credit of radical pacifists, they totally recognize this, right? That police are violent and we should oppose the police as a result of that. So no shade on that by any means. But I think that there is a certain allergy to violence and a valorization of nonviolence that comes especially liberal societies and liberal people in particular. Where it's violence is bad because I don't really want to see it. That's kind of what it boils down to.
Yeah. Yeah, that's sort of an idealistic view of violence.
Yeah. All right. So Matt, would you say it's fair to say that we think you should have a nuanced opinion about violence that recognizes that violence is complicated and maybe sometimes potentially even necessary or good?
Yeah, I think it's all complicated. I think it's all very,
All right.
like, yeah, totally.
Well,
I'm just thinking of all the
I ask you that.
Sorry, man. I'm just like, yeah, violence is bad. I don't want to do it, but also I understand like sort of like the nuance of it that that like, you know, it's hard to be like a communist and not think that like, well, at least some violence is okay.
Yeah. Let me back up to you and say, okay, violence is not good. Not going to say that, but complicated and potentially okay. Maybe I'd walk it back that way.
Potentially okay, and also I guess, man, sorry, there's so much nuance. It's hard to make us like a sort of blanket statement that I'll just agree with.
Yeah.
Okay, violence is bad. I don't want to participate in it, but at the same time, I have to every day. Like,
right.
In that
exactly.
sense, like where I think that we have to recognize our complicity in a certain type of violence, like whether it's you know, the violence of like wage labor or the violence of white supremacy that like I definitely benefit from because I'm a white person. Like I just like, you know, I'm not okay with it, and I think that it sucks, and I wish that I could be a complete and total pacifist or something, but I realize that the only way to live my life is sort of like, you know, made possible because I'm complicit in violent systems.
Right. No, I think it's a good way to frame it for sure. I think some of the real sticky stuff comes in when you start talking about how to oppose that kind of violence with other kinds of violence or violence in the service of something else. And I think, okay, so, I mean, let's put our cards on the table. Like, I think that sometimes violence is not something to be desired, but something that is nevertheless necessary because in certain conditions or situations. And historically has accomplished good things, has accomplished, like, violence has contributed to qualitatively better forms of life, having gone through that sort of apocalypse of violence than the form of life that preceded it.
I would agree, yes.
But okay, good. I think there's a lot more to be said about violence than people like want to say. But at the same time, I also think that there is a weird sort of bloodlust that sometimes happens on the left, and I think that's especially strange in places like the United States. So if you look at like speeches and diaries from revolutionaries like Mao or Fidel or Lenin or a number of other people, you can find a lot of really interesting reflections on how they wish that they didn't have to go to war or didn't have to be in a violent situation. But the kinds of unjust societies that they live in compel them to those violent or warlike responses. And obviously you can find a lot of quotes glorifying war and violence in those same authors as well, but I think even still it's often only insofar as it's related to a real people struggle, which makes all the difference. And I think, like, sometimes I just get uncomfortable with how certain lefties talk about violence, like constantly calling for the heads of the rich or posting guillotine memes, like, really flippantly or whatever. I mean, I get it. Like, you shouldn't be concerned about, like, the bourgeois feelings of, I don't know, whatever. Rich people or liberals. Like, that's okay, sure. But also, like, violence is a weird rhetoric that really turns people away for no actually good reason. And I think it's important to recognize that violence is always, for both Christians and people on the left, should always be a thing that you would prefer not to have to do. Like, you do it because you finally feel that there's no other way. And I think that's just a sentiment that kind of gets lost, actually, in some conversations about violence.
Yeah, I think so. And for people on the left, I think that kind of feeling is actually just being a good materialist. Like, there's nothing in Marx that prescribes a violent revolution other than, like, you know, if the material conditions call for that type of struggle, then, like, that's like what you do. The sort of, like, wanting for violence is not inherent, and I guess in leftist struggle, it just is. It's there if the bourgeoisie make it there, you know? It's like,
right.
If those are the conditions that have been produced and the bourgeoisie are going to fight you for it, then I guess, like, you have to.
Yeah.
But it's not, like, good.
Right.
Wouldn't it be better if, like, we could just have a revolution without violence? Like, yes, everyone would agree, but that's usually not the case.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the other piece, is that we should want a revolution that doesn't have to be violent. But we shouldn't sort of assume that that means that all revolutions are unjust or that all the violence used in them are somehow, like, a priori morally indefensible or something.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that we can even see some of that, like, you know, like that negotiation of like violence isn't actually what we want in some of these like revolutionary figures. Like Fidel is one of them too. Like if you kind of read about the Cuban Revolution, like after the revolution was basically won, Fidel like didn't say like, yeah, go and like just kill all of the sort of like Batista forces that are still here. He was just like, capture them and like whatever. But he wasn't like, going out of his way to be especially cruel or especially violent or something. He was a person that obviously wanted to like unite an entire country now that he had it. So I don't know. You can see examples elsewhere how people negotiate violence.
Yeah, and I think you could do a pretty interesting kind of biblical or theological study of that ambiguity about violence. I mean, I'm not a Bible scholar, so I won't pretend to be one, but I just always think of passages like, or stories, I guess, where, like David, he like goes to war and then he wants to build a temple to God, and God's like, I don't know, you're like a little too covered in blood to do that, I think. But God doesn't really tell him like not to go to war. He just tells him that war has sort of dirtied him in a certain way. And I think that like those kinds of perspectives are probably more interesting in the Bible than people even recognize right off the bat. That like there is a fundamental ambiguity about violence throughout the entire Christian tradition, and what that means is we have to be honest about the like the badness of violence and the sort of, I don't know if necessity is the right word, but like the moments when violence is kind of demanded in a situation or something like that.
Yeah, where either you have to like sort of choose violence or just choose like more violence.
Right.
I mean, like,
or like the perpetuation of violence or something.
Right, exactly. I mean, like that's what's at case in most like sort of pre-revolutionary situations. It's like you could either fight back or, I don't know, let everyone suffer more.
Right. Well, maybe we should sort of talk about this from another angle too, about peace, I think. Because peace and war, or like peace and violence, are things that are often juxtaposed, and like it makes sense that they are, right? We want to live in a peaceful society, not a violent or warring society. But what does it mean to actually like talk about that? I think that's another sort of rhetorical, like big mud trap that we can get stuck in for a minute. I don't know, Matt. Any hot takes about peace?
Yeah, I think that Christians have a lot to say about peace, or like we have a lot of sort of like rich biblical metaphor to think about peace with, at least. I mean, like Jesus is, the Prince of Peace. That's like the language we use to talk about Jesus. Or like, I don't know, I always think about sort of like the I think it's like in Isaiah where it's like the wolf will lie down with the lamb, that whole kind of thing. Or it happens in Revelation too. But that's there's like a picture of biblical peace where like fighting stops, and that there is sort of like a togetherness. Christians like to talk about that and like think about those types of images, and John McNaughton's got a few of them pictures. I'm pretty sure he's got like sort of a lion and the lamb sort of picture out there on his website. So Christians like to think about peace because the Bible kind of gives us a glimpse of it every now and again, but we don't have a lot of thoughts about like what peace takes to like maintain or make or keep, just that like what it looks like. So peace is an idea that I think has some deep biblical metaphor, and the Christians have a lot to say about it, but like I don't think we really know what it is.
Yeah, I think that's right. And to also remember that I mean, there's something to be said about Christian prefigurative eschatological politics that I think is challenging and cool, but at the same time, like, we still don't live there yet. And that's just kind of the difficult in-between time that we're forced into.
Yeah. So talking about peace always makes me think of my dude, Richard Gilman-Opalski, and this thing that he says in his recent book, Spectres of Revolt. And it's kind of like a depressing thought, but it's true. So I guess we should... all truth's God's truth. Gotta figure it out. So Richard Gilman-Opalski says this: "The present war is never the last war. The war to end all wars has never happened. Whenever there has not been a war, or when one is taking place, a future war remains somewhere on the horizon. Thus, times of peace cannot be called post-bellum, because there is no after war. There's only before war. It's always antebellum." Oof.
Yikes.
I guess like this quote is important to me because it recognizes wars within like sort of the historical deep time that there's always been a war, or there always is a war. There always will be a like coming war. And that is an idea that I think is antithetical to Christianity, because like, I don't know, we are a group of people with an eschatology that proclaims sort of like a time of peace. But until whatever that is happens, I think that we are always living in this antebellum period. We're always before the war.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, it's also interesting because you could think of the Christian eschaton as a postbellum, the only kind of postbellum.
Yeah.
Which really changes the way that you think about the kind of victory that God wins or something in history, I think, by being truly postbellum. I like that.
Yeah, there's like a Paul Virilio feel to the postbellum as well. Like, only after the one big explosion is there a postbellum or something.
Right. Well, let me, so you got your boy Richard Gilman-Opolsky. Let me read something from anher one of our boys, Vladimir Lenin.
Somewhere else in that political compass quadrant.
So Lenin has a really interesting little essay called The Question of Peace, and there's a lot in it that is worth looking at, but I wanted to pull out just this one little quote. He says, "An end to wars, peace among the nations, the cessation of pillaging and violence, such is our ideal. But only bourgeois sophists can seduce the masses with this ideal, if the latter is divorced from a direct and immediate call for revolutionary action." I think that is really important, and maybe kind of the whole driving force behind what I'm getting at, that like an end to war, peace, maybe even stopping something like violence, all that kind of stuff is good to have as an ideal, but only insofar as it's tied to like a full revolutionary situation. I don't know exactly how to spell that out if you're a pacifist, but for Lenin, it obviously meant like having a civil war and like winning it. And obviously, like the Soviet Union did not end up becoming an end to war or peace among the nations by any stretch. But I think that like even then, war is still contextualized in a larger project to end war. Whereas in a place like the United States, like war is contextualized in a larger project to actually continue to police the borders of capitalism, which is the preservation of a certain kind of class war. So I don't know, like maybe that's too easy. Maybe this is kind of my like Elul Christian version of just being like, yeah, well, I don't know, if you're a communist, that means that you're ultimately against war. In a way that sort of cops me out of some more complicated questions. But I think that there's something to it. Like there's something to contextualizing a hope for peace within a certain kind of discernible struggle, like a struggle for the end of things like a class war or white supremacy or what have you.
Yeah, this is going to sound so dumb after just quoting some really smart people, but I don't care. I'm not a very smart person, so I'm just going to do it anyways. Over the last few months, I've been watching the show The Americans, which is a really great TV show, and I really love it. So if you're out there and you're thinking like, man, I need a show to watch, just check out The Americans. So generally, the show is about these two Soviet spies who infiltrate the United States and like live these like relatively normal American lives while also having like these, double lives as secret communist agents. But what I really find interesting about the show is the way the two main characters talk about sort of like why they are socialists, and like they're still there. It's funny because like they're like, they're benefiting from all like the nice American amenities, but they're like, well, we're here kind of doing this like dirty work because we believe in like the project of peace in the world. So like that's the rhetoric that the writers for the show adopted, and like who knows if they had actually even read Lenin or something. But still, it's like it's an interesting way to put it. Like you are in a real sense like the Soviet Union did not end war and probably exacerbated it in some situations. But at the same time, like to fight against capitalism is to fight against war in a certain sense, because capitalism is something that perpetuates war and makes money off of it. Not to say that the Soviet Union probably didn't either, because there are some really good sort of post-colonial critiques that can be made for sure, but still I think it kind of rings true to what you were saying, Dean.
Yeah, well, then it must be right.
You gotta watch The Americans though.
I do. I never got around to it, but maybe now I will after that hot insight.
Their daughter in The Americans joins a church group and she like ends up going to protests with the pastor. Like they go and like they're protesting like nuclear weapons in the show. And
cool.
yeah, it is funny, but so she goes and but the parents are just like, if she only knew the real truth about the world. Like, get over it, man. Like your kid's going to protest something awesome. Just like find a good way to like talk to her about it. I mean,
That's
it's like
really
such
funny.
an easy inroad to making her communist, and eventually they do. Spoiler alert! But anyways, it's great. It's a good show, and there's going to be a new season, and I'm going to watch it.
Oh, me too. Maybe I'll catch up.
Get caught up.
Then
It's
we can do a spin-off. The Magnificast watches the Americans.
I think it'd be a great idea. There's so much sort of like Christian communist content in the show. Why not?
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah.
Well, you heard it here first. So maybe we could say that there's a dialectical relationship between nonviolence and violence, or between those tactics, or between them as worldviews, or however we want to kind of think of them on a scale. But a lot of activists on the ground seem to recognize that relationship already. So you see it in some people involved with groups like Christian peacemaker teams, for example, who have a totally nonviolent role in conflict zones, but they don't use that role to like judge people engaging in violence in those conflict zones necessarily. It's more like they've made a commitment and they use that to try to help the struggle for justice, but they don't use that as a bludgeon against people who are being violent. And I think probably though the more important thing is like historically how these two groups relate. So I guess one book that's kind of becoming a classic on it, even though it's pretty recent, is Charles E. Cobb's book, This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed. He tries to show like the intertwined history of violence and nonviolence in the Black liberation movement in the U.S. in particular. So here's a couple of quotes that I think are kind of relevant here. So this is one just thing that he notes. As noted in 1964 by Robert P. Bob Moses, director of the Mississippi Project of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, it's not contradictory for a farmer to say he's nonviolent and also pledge to shoot a marauder's head off. That probably sounds pretty contradictory, but Cobb like goes to pretty great lengths to show why it isn't, especially if you're a black person in the U.S. when like the Klan is running around actually trying to be marauders and trying to murder farmers. So there's a lot more that goes into it, obviously, but he tries to spell out the way in which even the nonviolent civil rights movement and kind of big major players in it like MLK or others, they all are kind of built into an ongoing history of violent struggle in the U.S. And like they sort of need each other, or at least they play off of each other in important ways. And one thing that I thought was really fascinating is he also pulls out an interesting Christian dimension to all this. So he says this, to be sure, in a significant portion of the Southern Black community, nonviolent resistance tapped deeply into a vein of righteousness that was rooted in Afro-Christian values and provided moral guidance in a political struggle where hate and anger could easily blind and become overwhelming. But an idealized acceptance of the kind of redemptive love and suffering expressed in the New Testament is the closest Black people have come to embracing the philosophy of nonviolence en masse. Black Christians, however, have also readily embraced the Old Testament with all its furies and violence. And I really think that's a fascinating piece of it, not just for understanding a specific historical community or historical time period, but for understanding, I guess, a kind of ambivalence within Christianity as a whole, that you have to wrestle through this. And I mean, the way that Cobb sort of articulates all this historically is totally worth investigating, I think, just because this is a conversation that like makes material differences. And is like way more complicated historically even than it seems to be theoretically.
Yeah, I think so. Well, I don't want to like cheapen the conversation by saying something like this, and I don't think it really does, but it adds, I guess, another layer to it that sometimes like nonviolence is just a good look.
Right.
And I guess that doesn't really cheapen it, because I mean, you have to think about the ways that struggle is sort of communicated across the this like media saturated hellscape that is 2018. Like I mean, you think about like, okay, maybe here's an example. Like the last time we talked about violence on the podcast, or maybe not the last time exactly, but a time we did, was when we talked about Cornel West and Tracy Blackman sort of nonviolently protesting in Charlottesville. and they were there, and it's like it's great. Like they're clergy people. They're sort of like, you know, really important figures, you know, social justice kind of figures in the United States. So it's a good look for them to like be there and sort of being nonviolent. At the same time, you know, the like anti-fascist protesters were there too, kind of protecting them from the fascists. So you have like kind of like both things. On the one hand, you have like a good look just for like the public, and then you also have people who are protecting that good look, which I think is an amazing tactic. There are all kinds of other types of like ways that nonviolence ends up just like looking good. It also, like, in the media, it can play as such like a moral high ground, that even though sometimes when it's not, it just like it makes people like really feel for the people who are sort of protesting in that way.
Totally.
I don't know if I've already referenced a TV show, but I'll reference a movie too. That's really great. I don't know if you've ever seen it, Dean. It's called Hunger. It's a 2008 movie about the IRA and Bobby Sands doing like the dirty protest and then the hunger strike that they did in the prison. Have you seen the movie?
I have not seen it.
Okay, well, it's a great movie. It's a hard movie to watch also, because it's like mostly quiet and pretty visceral, a visceral film with many bodies. If you guys don't know about Bobby Sands and the IRA, you should check it out. They were like these, basically the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. They were an armed militant group that were trying to sort of gain their independence from England. And a bunch of them were arrested and put in jail. So when they were in prison, they were being treated as regular prisoners rather than political prisoners. And to protest that, they did two things that were two non-violent forms of protest. One was called like the dirty protest, and they just like didn't take showers and made the guards like not want to be near them, which is a pretty interesting tactic. Like if the guards are beating you, become so smelly that they don't want to touch you. And the other protest was that they just had a hunger strike where they like, you know, they held their own bodies captive until they got what they want. And Bobby Sands ended up dying because of it, which is a real something. It's like really something to think about. I mean, like that's a real huge sacrifice for a movement. But anyways, the hunger strikes and the dirty protests, they ended up being like a really important sort of moment for the IRA in the media, because they showed a certain type of like moral high ground that the British government didn't have at the time. So it worked in a sense that it was like protest as a type of public relations, where people ended up being on their side because of that type of media representation. There's all kinds of times that doesn't play out very well either. Like, damn, all these ideas are just kind of coming to me now, and I feel stupid for not preparing more. But like, there's a pretty famous hunger strike too in Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, where the inmates were like, you know, again putting their bodies on the line because they are experiencing some extremely bad conditions and bad treatment, and the United States press covered it like a little bit, but then Guantanamo Bay completely blocked the press out. And I think to this day there still are no sort of outside press allowed into the prison, because like if they covered something like that, it would I think make people feel a lot differently about Guantanamo Bay and like the prisoners that are there. So anyways, all that to say that I think there's definitely like an ethical and moral claim to nonviolence that Christians should think about, and Christians definitely have thought about already, but there's also a real tactical element to it in the sense that like sometimes it's just like a really good idea. It's like a really courageous idea. I mean, a hunger strike is a terrible thing that I can't imagine doing to myself, but it's something that definitely works and builds momentum for your movement.
I think that's a really good way of kind of articulating it, that like these are things that really work, like strategies that actually can be extremely useful and effective. There's no denying that. And I think, I don't know, I guess like what I would hope to see is more Christians who are open to the nuances of both of those things. And I think that's happening, like in conversations that I've had and kind of discourses that I've watched. It seems that the like hardline ideological pacifism especially is kind of opening up in really interesting ways to at least kind of recognizing that like the distance that's there between pacifist tactics and violence tactics isn't necessarily one of like moral superiority or judgment or anything like that, but just one of like a distance in specific tactics or something. And I think that's probably a good horizon. I think like violence and nonviolence, I mean, we opened this conversation talking about the problems of defining those terms. And obviously like throughout the whole thing, we never defined them either. And I think that's because you actually can't. Like violence and nonviolence are rhetorical tools. They are like terms that create discourses, and they allow certain things to be possible and other things to be not possible. Like they allow some things to be said, other things to be not said, some things to be judged, other things to be like readily accepted. And I think that like when you can kind of pull some of that back, it helps to understand maybe how you're wading into that rhetorical game yourself, and how certain material realities in the world are being either opened up or obscured by that rhetoric.
Yeah, that reminds me, man, I'm just full of things that I'm being reminded of tonight. But one time in my undergrad, there's this really weird thing that happened where the sociology professor at my university debated the philosophy professor at my university about whether or not Christians should support just war theory or they should be pacifists. And at the end, they had this kind of nice moment. It was actually a really heated debate. But at the end, they had this nice moment where they were like, well, even if you decide that you're just like a just war Christian and not like a pacifist Christian, I think that like what you can recognize is that you probably have more in common as a just war Christian with pacifists than you do with like sort of like Christians who fully sort of engage in the like militaristic worship of, you know, the United States military or something. And I think there's something to say about the Christians on the left too, but like in a different way. Even if you're a Christian who believes in you know, that violence might be a material necessity in like because of class war or something, or you're a Christian who thinks that nonviolence is the only way to go, I think that like you know, those two types of Christians have a lot more in common than Christians who are just, you know, like liberals or something.
Yeah, I think that's totally right.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/the Magnificast. You can follow us on Twitter. Join our Facebook group called the Magnificast Basement. There's lots of good stuff going on there for sure. Sign up for Dean's class for sure at icscanada.edu, or that's at least where you can get more information, I guess. Is that right?
Please do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I really want to run it, so I need people to sign up for it.
Thank you to our sponsors, The Americans on FX. You can check that out on May 30th when season 6 starts. Check out The Americans. Get ready for it. Magnificast watches The Americans, which is a podcast that is definitely going to happen for sure. Thank you, Amaria Armstrong, for the intro music. Thanks to The Illogical Spoon for our outro music, and we'll see you next time.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord.